Welcome to the channel. Today we are going to embark on a fascinating story that marked the United States through Abraham Lincoln, one of the great presidents who made history in the years 1861 to 1865. Who was Abraham Lincoln? He was the 16th President of the United States, an American politician who held office from March 4th, 1861, until his assassination on April 15th, 1865. He led the country through its greatest internal crisis, the American Civil War, abolishing slavery, preserving the country's territorial integrity, and strengthening the national government at that time. During his term, Lincoln had already demonstrated his opposition to slavery and its expansion throughout the United States. In addition, Lincoln stood out for his position against the Mexican-American War, a conflict between the United States and Mexico over control of Texas. Born into a humble family on the western frontier, Lincoln was self-educated, earned a law degree, became a leader of the Whig Party, served as a state representative in Illinois in the 1830s, and served a term in the House of Representatives in the 1840s. In 1858, after a series of debates that gained national attention and highlighted his opposition to slavery, Lincoln lost a race for the Senate to his main rival, Stephen A. Douglas. Representing a key state, Lincoln, considered a moderate, won the Republican Party's presidential nomination in 1860. Despite having little support in the South, he won widespread freedom in the North and was elected president. His victory led 7 Southern slave states to declare their secession from the Union and form the Confederate States of America. This split gave Lincoln's party significant control in Congress, but there was no effective action to promote reconciliation. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln stated, "Both sides rejected war, but one would be willing to initiate it to prevent the nation from surviving, while the other would accept it to prevent the nation from being at war." After the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, the North vigorously supported national unity, and Lincoln turned his political and military efforts toward war, with the goal of reuniting the country. In the face of rebellion in the South, he used his authority to suspend habeas corpus, allowing thousands of suspected secessionists to be arrested and temporarily detained without trial. In 1861, Lincoln skillfully handled a diplomatic conflict, preventing the United Kingdom from registering the Confederate States as an independent nation. His fight against slavery included signing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, encouraging border slave states to abolish slavery, and promoting the passage of the 13th Amendment, which ended the practice for good in December 1865. Lincoln closely oversaw war strategy, especially the selection of generals, most notably Ulysses S. Grant, who led the Union to victory in 1865. To strengthen his government, Lincoln rallied leaders from the major factions of his party, demanding cooperation. Under his leadership, the Union implemented a naval blockade that economically isolated the South, secured control of the border states, dominated the southern river systems with gunboats, and attempted several times to capture Richmond, a Confederate capital. Lincoln replaced ineffective generals until he found success with Grant in 1865. Lincoln was an extremely skilled politician and deeply involved in the power dynamics in each state. He bypassed the support of the war Democrats and secured his re-election in 1864. As the leader of a moderate wing of the Republican Party, Lincoln found that his policies and personality generated intense and varied reactions. The radical Republicans imposed harsh punishments on the South. The war Democrats sought greater compromise, while the Copperheads, pacifist Democrats, rejected conflict. The most extreme secessionists conspired to assassinate him. Politically, Lincoln attacked his opponents by pitting them against each other and winning over public opinion through his oratorical skill. His Gettysburg Address of 1863 became a landmark speech, highlighting the ideals of nationalism, republicanism, and the rise of a nation. At the end of the war, faced with deep divisions in the country, Lincoln adopted a moderate stance on Reconstruction, seeking to reunify the nation quickly with a policy of generous reconciliation. However, 6 days after the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, an actor and Confederate sympathizer. He was the first U.S. president to be assassinated or to have plunged the nation into international turmoil. To this day, Lincoln is widely regarded by scholars and the public as one of the 3 greatest presidents in history. Lincoln's early years. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin on the sinking Spring Farm in Hardin County, now LaRue County, Kentucky. He was the son of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks, a descendant of Samuel Lincoln, an English immigrant who arrived in Massachusetts in the 17th century. His paternal grandfather, also named Abraham, was killed in an Indian attack in 1786, in the presence of his children, including Thomas. The family, who attended a Baptist church that preached moral values and condemned slavery, moved several times due to the purchase and sale of farms. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was an influential man in the county, owning land, cattle, and horses, and delegating public functions such as overseeing slaves and assessing properties. However, in 1816, he lost his land due to problems related to lawsuits due to property titles that were incorrect. Lincoln's family moved north across the Ohio River in search of slavery-free territory and a new start in what was then Perry County, now Spencer County, Indiana. Lincoln claimed that the move was motivated primarily by the issue of slavery, but also by difficulties with land titles. In Indiana, at the age of 9, he lost his mother, Nancy, who died on October 5, 1818, after drinking milk contaminated with toxins from the snake root plant. His older sister, Sarah, cared for him until the following year, when their father remarried. Sarah died in 1828 at the age of 20 during stillbirth. Lincoln's new stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widowed mother of 3, became an important figure in his life. He formed a strong bond with her, calling her Mom. During his childhood, Lincoln disliked the hard work of the Old West lifestyle and was even considered a slouch by some family members and neighbors. However, as he matured, he devoted himself to the domestic duties expected of a young man, working as a lumberjack and building fences. His strength and courage were highlighted after a wrestling match with the leader of the Clarywood's gang of hoodlums, which earned him local respect. Although he never competed professionally, his wrestling skills were frequently cited in his political campaigns. Lincoln continued the tradition of giving his father his earnings from his labor until he was 21, and even after that he continued to help his father financially. However, the relationship between the two became distant, in part because of Thomas's lack of encouragement for education. Lincoln received only about a year of formal education from itinerant teachers, but he was self-taught and passionate about reading. He sought out books in nearby villages and repeatedly read such works as the King James Bible, Aesop's Fables, Defoe's Robinson Crusoe's Pilgrim's Progress, and the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. In 1830, concern about an outbreak of toxin-tainted milk along the Ohio River, the same disease that had killed Lincoln's mother, the family moved to public land in Macon County, Illinois, a state free of slavery. The following year, Thomas Lincoln moved the family to a new government-granted farm in Coles County, Illinois. At the age of 22, Lincoln decided to go his own way and set out for the village of New Salem in Sangamon County, sailing down the Sangamon River. In the spring of 1831, he and friends were hired by businessman Denton Offutt to transport goods up the Illinois and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. During his time in New Orleans, Lincoln saw the reality of slavery firsthand, which had a profound impact on him before he returned home. Abraham Lincoln had a relationship with in Rutledge in 1835, but she died young, at the age of 22, of typhoid fever. He later courted Mary Owens, but both called it quits. In 1839, Lincoln met Mary Todd from a wealthy, slave-owning family in Kentucky. After a broken engagement in 1841, they reconciled and were married on November 4th, 1842. The couple had 4 children, Robert, Edward, Willie, and Thomas Tad. Only Robert lived to adulthood and had descendants, with Lincoln's last grandchild dying in 1985. Edward, Willie, and Tad died young, deeply affecting their parents. Lincoln suffered from depression, while Mary Todd suffered extreme stress and hallucinations after the losses and was committed to an asylum in 1875. She later lived in France and returned to her sister's home, where she died in 1882. Lincoln and Mary Todd's visits to the Todd family estate in Lexington, Kentucky, revealed the contradictions in his personal and political life, as he maintained ties to a family linked to slavery while championing abolitionist ideas throughout his career. Despite family and personal challenges, Lincoln devoted himself to his work and his vision of a united and free country. Tragedies in his personal life, including the loss of his children and Mary's mental health issues, shaped his personality and likely influenced his empathy. His relationship with Mary Todd was tumultuous, but also full of companionship, reflecting the intense and difficult context of their lives. Mary, despite her international struggles, supported Lincoln during his political rise and his presidency, facing the tragedies that occurred during that period. Together, they navigated the challenges of the Civil War and the social transformations that marked the United States. Lincoln's career and military service. In 1832, at the age of 23, Lincoln purchased a store in New Salem, but sold his interest due to economic hardship. That same year, he launched his first political campaign for the Illinois General Assembly, gaining local popularity for his skills as a storyteller. However, his lack of formal education, resources, and influential connections led to his defeat, despite defensive improvements to the navigation of the Sangamon River. Despite his defeat, Lincoln's experience in the 1832 campaign was a stepping stone to his political career. He continued to engage in local issues and build his confidence as an orator, which helped him gain more support in future elections. The defeat did not discourage Lincoln, but rather motivate him to seek out more leadership opportunities, gradually developing the skills that would lead him to become one of the most beloved presidents. Prior to his election, Lincoln had served as a captain in the Black Hawk War. Upon his return, he continued his campaign for the Illinois General Assembly. At 6 feet 4 inches, Lincoln was imposing and strong, giving him presence. In his first speech, he defended a supporter who had been attacked, throwing the attacker to the ground. Despite his local popularity, Lincoln finished 8th out of 3 candidates, receiving 277 votes out of 300 in the New Salem district, but was not elected, as only the top 4 candidates were eligible. Lincoln worked as a postmaster and county surveyor in New Salem while continuing his legal studies through self-education, reading books such as William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. In 1834, he was elected to the state legislature as a Whig, with the support of many Democrats. After passing the bar exam in 1836, he moved to Springfield and began practicing law with John Todd Stewart. Lincoln became a skilled lawyer, known for his skill in cross-examination and argument. From 1841 to 1844, he was a law partner of Stephen T. Logan and then of William Herndon, a promising young man. He also served 4 consecutive terms in the House of Representatives as a Whig. Between 1835 and 1836, Lincoln voted to expand manhood suffrage regardless of land ownership. He was notable for his free soil stance, which opposed both slavery and abolitionism. In 1837, Lincoln argued that slavery was unjust and harmful, but that abolitionism would make it worse. He also supported the American Colonization Society's program, which aimed to help freed slaves establish themselves. Abraham Lincoln's 1860 presidential campaign and nomination. The Illinois Republican State Convention, held May 9 to 10, 1860 in Decatur, marked the beginning of Lincoln's presidential campaign. His supporters, led by David Davis, Norman Judd, Leonard Swett, and Jesse Du Bois, organized support for his candidacy, with Lincoln being nicknamed the Rail Candidate in reference to his frontiersman image. On May 18th, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, he won on 3 ballots, defeating candidates such as William H. Seward and Salmon P. Chase. Hannibal Hamlin, a former Democrat from Maine, was chosen as vice president to balance the ticket. Lincoln's victory was fueled by his moderate views on slavery and his support for Whig programs of international amelioration and protective tariffs. Pennsylvania, with its iron interests, played a major role in Lincoln's rise to the top on the 3rd ballot. Lincoln's campaign focused on securing the support of key delegations. Most Republicans sided with Lincoln in claiming that the North was the one who had been harmed by events such as the influence of the slave power that had blocked the federal government's alliance with the Dred Scott case and the presidency of James Buchanan. During the 1850s, Lincoln questioned the possibility of a civil war, and his supporters rejected the idea that his election would trigger secession. During this period, Stephen A. Douglas was chosen as the Democratic candidate for the North. However, delegates from 11 states walked out of the Democratic National Convention in protest against Douglas's popular sovereignty proposal and chose John C. Breckinridge to represent them as their candidate. While other candidates, such as Douglas, gave speeches during their campaigns, Lincoln was the only one who did not directly engage in speeches. Instead, he closely monitored the campaign and relied on the enthusiasm of the Republican Party. The party was divided by the North, producing a large number of posters, pamphlets, and newspaper articles. Thousands of Republican speakers focused primarily on the party platform and, in the background, on Lincoln's life story, highlighting the poverty he had caused as a child. The aim was to emphasize the power of free labor, showing that an ordinary country boy could achieve great things through his own efforts. During the campaign, Republican literary output weakened the opposition, with a writer for the Chicago Tribune producing a pamphlet with a detailed biography of the candidate that sold 100,000 to 200,000 copies. Presidency. The 1860 election and Lincoln's secession. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, defeating Stephen A. Douglas, John C. Breckinridge, and John Bell. Lincoln won with majority support in the North and West, but received no votes in 10 of the 15 slave states in the South, winning only 2 southern counties. He received 1,866,452 popular votes, while Douglas received 1,376,957, Breckinridge 849,781, and Bell 588,789. The electoral comparison was 82.2%. Lincoln won the free states of the North, as well as California and Oregon, while Bell won Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and Breckinridge dominated the rest of the South. The decisive result came in the Electoral College, where Lincoln obtained 180 votes against 123 for the other candidates. Even if all the opponents had united, Lincoln would still have won. With Lincoln's victory in the 1860 election now clear, secessionists expressed their intention to secede from the Union before the new president's inauguration in March. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to declare secession. On February 1st, 1861, 6 other states, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed suit and seceded. 6 of these states adopted a new constitution and proclaimed themselves a sovereign nation, the Confederate States of America. The northernmost southern and border states, such as Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and Arkansas, initially rejected the secession movement. Both President James Buchanan and President-elect Lincoln refused to recognize the Confederacy, considering secession illegal. On February 9, 1861, the Confederacy elected Jefferson Davis as its provisional president. There were attempts at compromise, such as the Crittenden Compromise, which sought to expand the Missouri Compromise line and divide the territories between slave and free states, something contrary to the Republican Party's Free Soil platform. Lincoln rejected this proposal, stating that he would rather die than accept such a concession. However, he supported the proposed Corwin Amendment, which would have protected slavery in the states where it already existed and prevented Congress from interfering in the matter without the consent of the South. Before his inauguration, Lincoln sent letters to governors and was open to the idea of a constitutional convention to seek further changes. During his inauguration trip, Lincoln evaded an assassination attempt in Baltimore and arrived in Washington, D.C., under military guard on February 23, 1861. In his inaugural address, he reaffirmed his intention of abolishing slavery in the southern states and appealed to the Union, assuring them that the accession of his government posed no threat to the property or safety of Southerners. Despite this, the Peace Conference of 1861 failed, and by March, no rebel leader had offered any terms for rejoining the Union. Lincoln and the Republicans believed that the dismantling of the Union could not be tolerated. After this, war broke out on April 12, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Union troops at Fort Sumter, forcing them to surrender, beginning the war. On April 15th, Lincoln appealed to all states to send detachments totaling 75,000 troops to recapture forts, protect Washington, and preserve the Union, which, in his view, still existed intact despite the events in the seceding states. On April 19th, Confederate sympathizers in Baltimore, who controlled the railroad network, attacked troops traveling to the capital. George William Brown, the mayor of Baltimore, and other suspected Maryland politicians were arrested and jailed, without warrants and with habeas corpus suspended. John Merryman, a leader of a secessionist group in Maryland, petitioned Chief Justice Roger B. Taney for a writ of habeas corpus, claiming that his arrest without a hearing was unconstitutional. Taney granted the writ of habeas corpus, but Lincoln ignored the court's decision. During the war and afterward, Lincoln came under heavy criticism from anti-war Democrats known as Copperheads. After the fall of Fort Sumter, Lincoln recognized the need to take immediate control of the war and planned to defeat the rebellion. Facing an unprecedented political and military crisis, he acted as commander-in-chief, using extraordinary powers, such as imposing a blockade of Confederate ports, releasing funds without congressional approval, and suspending habeas corpus, arresting thousands of suspected Confederate sympathizers. Supported by Congress in the North, he also sought to strengthen ties with the border states. Lincoln focused on military efforts and understood that bipartisan support was essential to victory, appointing both Republicans and Democrats to key positions in the military. He faced criticism from both Copperheads, who disapproved of his refusal to compromise on the issue of slavery, and from radical Republicans, who criticized his slow abolition of slavery. On August 6, 1861, he signed the Confiscation Act, which allowed the confiscation of slaves used by Confederate forces, signaling political support for abolition, although the law had limited impact. Lincoln understood that prior to 1865, the Constitution limited the power of the federal government and the abolition of slavery, leaving the issue to the individual states to decide. Before and during his election, he believed that abolishing slavery would help expand into new territories. At the beginning of the war, he tried to persuade the states to accept emancipation with compensation for slave owners. He rejected proposals that would have limited slavery to specific territories, as this would have jeopardized his relationship with the border states, which, while allowing slavery, remained in the Union. In 1862, Congress passed laws that banned slavery in federal territories and established procedures for freeing slaves from those involved in the war. Lincoln, believing that he did not have the power to abolish slavery in the states, sought to do so as commander-in-chief, using military force. In 1862, he proposed the Emancipation Proclamation, which was announced on January 1, 1863, freeing slaves in the Confederate States. Some Democrats and pacifists opposed it, seeing emancipation as an obstacle to peace. In a letter dated August 22, 1862, Lincoln made it clear that his primary goal was to save the Union, and any action on slavery was a measure toward that end, not a priority in itself. Lincoln's re-election, 1864, and assassination. Abraham Lincoln's re-election in 1864 was marked by significant challenges, both politically and militarily. During his first presidency, Lincoln had led the nation through the Civil War, with the goal of preserving the Union and ending slavery in the Confederate States. The war was far from over by 1864, and many questioned his ability to hold the country together, especially as the conflict wore on and the death toll mounted. However, Lincoln was able to win a second term, defeating Democrat George McClellan, a former commander of the Union forces who opposed continuing the war. Lincoln's victory was driven by a number of factors, including the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, and the advance of Union forces, especially after the decisive victories at the battles of Atlanta and Shenandoah. His re-election symbolized the support of the American people for his leadership in the fight to preserve the Union and end slavery. However, just a few months after his victory on April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was tragically assassinated. The assassination took place at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., while Lincoln was watching the play Our American Cousin. The assassin was John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathetic actor who believed that Lincoln's death would help revive the Confederate cause. Booth shot Lincoln in the head, and the president died the next day, on April 15, 1865. Lincoln's death sent shockwaves through the nation. He was the first U.S. president to be assassinated, and his death came at a pivotal moment in the nation's history, shortly after the Civil War had ended and the Union had won. Lincoln's loss left a gap in U.S. leadership during the difficult process of Reconstruction, while divisions left over from the war had to be healed and the Southern states reintegrated into the Union. Lincoln's assassination also had a lasting impact on the political future of the United States. His successor, Andrew Johnson, who assumed the presidency, struggled to implement a Reconstruction policy that was acceptable to both the North and the South, resulting in a period of intense political struggle. Lincoln was remembered as a national hero, not only for his victory in the Civil War, but also for his steadfast leadership and struggle for the emancipation of slaves. His untimely death made him an icon in American history, revered for his vision and courage during one of the nation's most tumultuous periods. Abraham Lincoln's legacy is one of the most profound and revered in American history. His presidency was marked by his unwavering leadership during the Civil War, a period of intense division and conflict in the country. Lincoln is widely remembered for his ability to preserve the Union, a Herculean task that involved making difficult decisions and demonstrating a clear moral vision, especially regarding the issue of slavery. The signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which declared the freedom of slaves in the rebellious states, and his tireless defense of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery nationwide, are historic milestones that cemented Lincoln's commitment to justice and human rights. His efforts to preserve the Union and ensure that the United States remained an indivisible nation are considered to be one of the greatest achievements of his presidency. Furthermore, Lincoln was instrumental in promoting the concept of a democratic government that, as he said in his famous Gettysburg Address, governs of the people, by the people, for the people. Today, Lincoln is widely admired, not only in the United States, but globally. He is seen as a leader who exemplified courage, wisdom, and compassion, facing the challenges of his time with a deep morality and a vision of justice for all. His legacy is often cited by political leaders and thinkers as a model of integrity, a role model in times of crisis and uncertainty. Lincoln's image transcended politics and became a symbol of the struggle for civil rights and equality. In the United States, he is revered as the great emancipator, and his efforts to abolish slavery are often remembered as one of the most significant contributions to the country's history. His advocacy for a unified nation without racial or political divisions still resonates in contemporary issues of social justice, racial equality, and human rights. However, Lincoln has also been the subject of critical analysis regarding some of his policies, such as his early stance on slavery in the border states and his gradualist approach to emancipation. Some schools of thought argue that his actions were shaped by political considerations, but his leadership continues to be seen as essential to the preservation of the democratic ideals of the United States. Globally, Lincoln is a respected figure. His principles of freedom, democracy, and human rights are often cited by leaders around the world as an example of effective and ethical governance. His image, including the famous portrait of him with a beard and top hat, is emblematic of leadership with moral courage. In short, Abraham Lincoln remains one of the most influential and revered figures in world history. His legacy endures as an example of resilience in the face of adversity, commitment to justice and the defense of human rights, and his vision of a unified nation continues to be a source of inspiration for generations. The respect he receives today, both in the United States and around the world, is a testament to his lasting impact on the formation of modern democratic values. Thank you for listening to this brilliant story of one of the greatest presidents of the United States. Leave your comment and like to help the channel, and be sure not to miss any of the upcoming stories. A big hug, and see you in the next video.